Walsh here for our latest weekly update. All this month, and really through the end of the year, calendar year, we've been talking about, and we'll continue to talk about, homelessness in Washington State and what the Republican Party's ideas are for actually doing something about getting people off the streets and into some kind of housing and into some kind of shelter. And I've been getting a lot of feedback, a lot of questions based on our last couple of updates and our published plan to reduce homelessness in Washington. And one of the hot topics, one of the key questions I get a lot about is questions about the so-called housing first homeless shelter strategy. Housing first is a theory of how to offer shelter, housing, to people who are on the street, to get them off the street and at least transitioning into some kind of permanent home, housing, apartment, something they can live in. And it's a controversial theory. Started, about 30 years ago, back east in New York. A couple of academics kind of championed the concept of housing first, and they backed it up with some anecdotal research based on shelters they themselves were involved in operating. The concept of housing first is to get an addict, and it really focuses on addicts, to get an addict off the street and into shelter. You don't condition giving the addict housing on the addict trying to get clean. You allow the addict to have a place to live while he or she is still in the throes of the addiction, actively using drugs or alcohol. Sometimes these shelters are called no barrier housing, sometimes low barrier housing. The concept is the same. Let the active user into free to the user housing, usually government sponsored, government paid housing, and hope that they get sober once they have a place to live. It's a controversial theory, frankly, because the evidence shows it doesn't work. It does not help addicts get sober. Housing for shelters have been tried outside of the New York City area, and their record in getting people into permanent housing, permanently off the street, is mixed at best. In my part of Washington State, a few years ago, we had a housing first shelter in the Kelso area of Washington. That was a disaster. It ended up attracting dealers, so they were using the free housing, really taxpayer paid housing, apartments it was, and they were dealing their drugs out of the free housing. This didn't help anyone. It didn't help anybody get sober. The shelter ultimately closed, and the people who were living there were back out on the street again. It didn't work. We as Republicans and common sense conservatives prefer an alternate approach. Sometimes it's called sober living shelters. Sometimes it's called coordinated entry, goes by different names. But our concept of giving shelter or transitional housing to get people off the streets is we do require that they are at least trying to get sober, to get their addiction under control. Now, we can approach it in different ways. We can be very strict about that attempt. We can be softer about it. But the point is that free shelter, really taxpayer housing, to people who are in active addiction ought to be tied to a program for them to get sober and try to get their lives on a better track in general. That's what we feel. There should be a sort of contract, or at least an agreement between the person receiving housing that they're going to get their life turned around and get sober in exchange for a place to live while they get sober. The last piece I want to talk about on this housing first versus sober living issue is in Washington, we have bureaucratic code. Now, it's not law. Remember the hierarchy: Constitution, statutory law, bureaucratic code. This is bureaucratic code that says that housing first shelters get priority in Washington state taxpayer funding over other types of shelters, shelter projects. I feel this is the wrong direction. We need at least to treat all shelter projects when it comes to receiving Washington state taxpayer money in the form of grants or subsidized programs. We need them all to be treated equally. We should not be giving preference in how we allocate taxpayer resources to a theory, a method of homeless transitional housing that's been proved not to work. We ought to treat sober living projects and housing first projects on an equal footing in terms of our state law, our state practice, and we ought really to tie free housing to at least an effort on the part of the recipient to turn their lives around and to get sober, get into treatment, get services that will help them stay off the streets, because that is the ultimate success in fighting homelessness. And I think that is a unifying concept. We all want to get people off the streets, but we want to get them off the streets so they stay off the streets and don't ping pong back and forth between those terrible conditions and some theory of housing that doesn't work. That's it for this week. We will continue to talk about fighting homelessness in Washington the rest of this month, and I'll talk to you again in a few days.
That's solid.
Kind of an